You must kill 100 people, serve time, then become famous on TikTok, YouTube, or Reels. That's probably what the hero of this video thought, or maybe not exactly. Anyway, make yourselves comfortable, it's gonna be interesting, that's for sure. Brazil, the city of Mogi das Cruzes. March 5, 2023. A car stopped by a house in a private neighborhood and two unidentified people got out. They headed toward the house where an old man was sitting and watching everything that was happening. Those men pulled out a pistol and shot the old man. To make sure he was dead, they then slit his throat with a knife. Then they got back in the car and drove away. And that's how one of the most notorious serial killers in Brazil, who was responsible for at least 71 lives, was killed. And he himself says the number is much higher. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, that's the name of the main character in this video. He experienced violence even before he was born. During one of the family quarrels, his father hit his pregnant wife in the stomach. As a result, when Pedro was born, he had a certain, let's say, skull deformation, but basically, considering that Pedro's mother was repeatedly beaten and generally humiliated by her beloved, it's actually surprising that he was born at all, as well as the 7 brothers and sisters in this family. The childhood years of the future killer were spent on the family farm, and to call them happy, well, that's not exactly the case. The family was constantly on the verge of poverty. The boy's mother was a very strict, religious person. She constantly took her children to the house of God, and even more often punished them for any violations of the laws of the Bible, or whatever you want to call them. You could get a spanking for almost anything, really. For example, Pedro often fell asleep during the sermons he attended. It was just because he wasn't interested, nothing special, but because of that, when he came home, his father would really beat him. It wasn't like, "You're a bad son." It was more like, "Come here, you're about to get punched in the face." Considering the atmosphere in that family, I guess it's no surprise that the kids didn't really gravitate toward their parents. Their own parents, but rather to their grandparents. Pedro, by the way, was actually their favorite. Grandpa often took him to work with him and taught him there how to, let's say, process animal carcasses. You have to admit, that's a useful skill for a future serial killer. By age 10, Pedro was already working to support his family. As you recall, they lived in poverty. The job was quite unusual, at least in my opinion, for a 10-year-old boy. In short, at first he killed small animals for their meat and skins. Then he got a job at a chicken farm. For Pedro, it wasn't just a job, but a place where his hidden aggression could find an outlet. He eventually became aggressive toward both animals and people, reportedly starting at age 13. So one day he was working with his older cousin, who had a horse. During a break, without asking for permission, Pedro jumped onto the horse, either to ride it or trying to steal it. Either way, such behavior made his cousin very angry, and he hit Pedro. Then he looked him in the eyes and said, "I'll kill you." The cousin was older, larger, and just laughed at Pedro's words. But this made Pedro even angrier, and he held a deep grudge. He didn't forget it, on the contrary, he kept thinking about it. It wasn't long before the cousins met again at the farm, and that time they were working near the sugarcane press. As soon as Pedro saw him, he immediately came up with a plan. The boy waited, then grabbed and pushed his cousin into the press. Therefore, his cousin's hand got caught in the press. His cousin screamed and begged for help. But Pedro wanted much more than that. He leaned in with his whole body and even tried to push his cousin in there completely. But he couldn't manage to push his cousin in there completely, into the press. So Pedro took a pair of scissors and started hitting his cousin with them. I mean, not just like that, but he started stabbing his cousin with the scissors just like with a knife. He later explained he tried to separate his cousin's body this way to gradually push it fully into the press. It didn't work. Eventually, all the farm workers heard the screams and ran over. Grandpa Pedro ran over with them. They turned off the press and saved the boy's cousin. He survived, as I already said, but he lost a limb, his arm. As for Pedro, he ended up behind bars. He only stayed a few nights, and the relatives chose not to press charges. Due to the boy's very young age, police released him to his relatives. And this, as you can understand, was a mistake. In less than a year, Pedro would commit other crimes. This time, he would see it through to the very end. In '68, of course, last century if you're curious, Pedro's father lost his job. The official version is that his father was accused of theft at work and was fired, but he himself said that wasn't true. Yes, there really was a theft, but apparently it was some co-worker of his who did it, and he just became the scapegoat. In any case, his father was fired, and for the family, it was a tragedy. Let me remind you, they weren't well off, and the family mainly relied on the father's income. In other words, the head of the family, so to speak. Now he didn't have a job, and if they were poor before, now they started living even poorer. Or you could say they used to live below the poverty line, just from the other side. Now they were below the poverty line, but on the opposite side. The head of the family found a way for himself to get through these tough times. Well, at least for himself. He began drinking more and as a result abused his wife and children more often. At the same time, he kept telling everyone, "I'm not guilty at all, folks. It was my partner who set me up at work." The employers didn't care, nor did the deputy mayor, who was somehow involved to ensure Pedro's father couldn't get hired anywhere else. In short, it was total injustice. These thoughts deeply impacted the man's son Pedro, the episode's main character. He was as outraged as his father by such injustice, and he decided to take action. At first, he tried working harder, but he quickly realized that this didn't really change the situation much. He needed a specific kind of justice, as he saw it. So, one day, Pedro went to the shed, took a rifle, a machete, a tent, and went to the mountains to think. Here is his quote. "I didn't go there to live or to hide from my problems. I had weapons, a plan, and I was going to take revenge." After about a month of such planning and thoughts, which were swarming in Pedro's head, he decided to act right away. He snuck into the deputy mayor's residence and waited. When the deputy mayor got out of the car, Pedro fired but missed at first. The deputy mayor heard the shot, turned in shock, and wondered what was happening as Pedro fired again. This time, it was a direct hit, the man died instantly, and Pedro disappeared from the scene. That's how at 14 he took revenge on those who wronged him and his family. In addition, he made the decision to become a sort of vigilante who would punish evil. According to Pedro, the next person who should pay for his father's unemployment, though that sounds like a rather interesting way to put it, was the security guard who actually worked with him. And Pedro's father said that he was actually the thief. This man continued working there while Pedro's father was unemployed. He lived well, at least by Pedro's standards, but his father was unemployed, drank, ruined the family, beat Pedro, and it was just unfair. In Pedro's opinion, to put it simply, he killed him. About a month after he dealt with the deputy mayor, he somehow sneaked into the workplace, hid in the utility room, and when the guard came, Pedro shot him several times. He hid the body and set the whole place on fire. Pedro, though very young for a serial killer, was already acting deliberately. Other killers, especially serial ones, on my channel that I've talked about, if you haven't watched, check them out. Pedro also didn't kid himself into thinking he was a Batman-like vigilante who'd never get caught. Actually, he wasn't smarter than all the other criminals. No, he knew that sooner or later they would catch up to him, arrest him, and that would be it. That's why he decided to run away as far as possible. He moved to São Paulo and settled in his godmother's house. In his new place, the 16-year-old young man met a woman nicknamed Botinha, the widow of a local drug dealer. Almost immediately, he became her lover, and in turn, the woman involved the young man in selling and distributing drugs in general. Let's just say she let him in, not only into her life, but also into the family business. Sorry for the pun. If it was offensive to you, I didn't mean to offend you. Ms. Botin was far from the least important person in this whole business, so Pedro wasn't lagging behind there either. She immediately promoted him up the hierarchy. But did his, let's call them colleagues, like it? No, the girlfriend of one of those colleagues once warned Pedro that an ambush was being prepared for him. They wanted to take him out. And thanks to this information, Pedro was armed with both knowledge and more than just that. He was able not only to fight off those who eventually attacked him, but also to kill, and for him, there were only advantages here. First, he clearly wasn't killed. He also gained real authority, no longer from dating the boss's ex, but because he could easily take down anyone who challenged him. Something like that. He even got a new nickname, the man who carries bullets, or something similar. They called him Cartusheira. Now everyone knew. He's small, but best not to mess with him. With more authority, Pedro began working harder, or rather, handling more goods. One time he had a deal with a guy named Chaina. I can't really call Pedro smart, especially since he tried to trick Chaina by stealing drugs and weapons from him. So, the deal of course didn't happen. This decision will have a huge impact on Pedro's future. He didn't know yet. Pedro's illegal dealings drew the attention of the so-called death squads, groups of police officers and people from security forces who independently and ruthlessly punish criminals. Pedro hid from them for a long time, but they eventually caught up with him. During that raid, they killed a woman, more precisely Pedro's lover, that very lady. Pedro escaped, but he struggled with the woman's loss. They kept hunting him, so he chose to run instead of seeking revenge. He ended up in western Rio de Janeiro, settling in Campo Grande. There, he soon met Maria, who helped him overcome the trauma. Well, in short, they really fell in love there. Moreover, she even got pregnant by Pedro, and they wanted this child. The couple moved in together and got ready for the baby. Pedro made a living by petty theft, but at the same time, he continued to kill. Moreover, mostly not for money, but for justice. Moreover, according to Pedro, he killed almost every day. He took the lives of those who, in his opinion, were worthless. That is, all kinds of people like rapists, drug dealers, murderers, etc. Basically, you could say that he himself belongs to that group, but that's something you can discuss a bit more in the comments. Rumors about Pedro Cartusheira spread through Brazil's slums. A man who was both feared and respected at the same time. He became a Latin Robin Hood, killing thieves, stealing from the rich, and giving their belongings to the poor. By the way, I can't say anything about that last part. I haven't found any reliably confirmed facts that he actually gave money to the poor. That's just gossip and rumors, but it's well known that Pedro truly helped some people. And they really respected and loved him, and so on. But of course, he ended up with even more enemies than he had before. So, one day Pedro came home, where he lived with his beloved Maria, who was pregnant, let me remind you, and he saw that she was dead, murdered. And on the wall, there was a message, "We will find you." That's how it was, and the event mentally destroyed Pedro. And from that moment on, basically, he couldn't think about anything else except revenge. He no longer cared about money, business, or anything else, only revenge. Nothing else interested him anymore. And in this case, you can see why. I don't even want to think about such a scenario in my own life. Basically, that's it, and you shouldn't think about it either. So, from that moment on, Pedro spent all his free time, or rather, not just his free time, but all his time, trying to find the people who wronged his beloved, or more precisely, the killers of his beloved and their unborn child. This turned out to be a much more difficult task than he had imagined. During this time, he killed many people he believed were involved in the murder. But so far he hadn't found them. In total, he spent a year on this. There is a version that one day Chaina's ex-wife came to visit him. Do you remember that guy? The one he supposedly took down? The drug dealer from whom he stole weapons and drugs? In short, the woman claimed that Chain ordered the murder of Maria, Pedro's girlfriend, and their unborn child. It seemed logical. I don't know why he hadn't thought of it earlier. Maybe he'd already killed many people there and been in so many situations that he was considering other options. But from what I know, it seems pretty logical. Pedro grabbed onto this information and started coming up with a specific plan for revenge against a specific person. He wanted to hurt Chaina as much as possible. From his own sources, he found out that Chaina's brother would soon be celebrating his wedding. Pedro conspired with his former friends from São Paulo and sneaked into the celebration. While the guests were drinking and celebrating, armed Pedro entered the hall. Pedro told all the women and children who were there to go upstairs and hide. Then he shot Chaina, but that wasn't enough for him. He also killed 7 more people and wounded 16, I think. Yes, 16. Most were Chaina's family and business partners. As I mentioned, by then, Pedro was already widely discussed in Brazil for his vigilante reputation. But, as you can imagine, after that bloody wedding, everyone started talking about him. I mean, on a national level. Before, the cops just watched him, but after this incident, a full manhunt began. They ordered him caught at any cost. What? In May 1973, again, last century if you were thinking otherwise, they finally tracked down and arrested Pedro. Just so you understand, at that time, the guy was only 19 years old. So all these murders, deaths, revenge, and so on happened when he wasn't even 19 yet. Well, one way or another, it seemed that the career of the Avenger and serial killer was over. But no, 18 murders, that's how many were attributed to Pedro, and that really pissed him off. He said, "No, I've already killed over 100 people. But one way or another, they were only able to prove his involvement in 22 cases. Then came the court hearing and the sentence. 128 years in prison. And let me remind you, that's only for some of the crimes. Not all 100 plus next, my dears. It gets more interesting, because it always gets more interesting. Sometimes the past is interesting, but right now, what's next matters more. While being transported to Araraquara, one of the strictest prisons in Brazil, handcuffed, Pedro killed a serial rapist who was with him in that van. As you can imagine, this immediately caught the attention of the other prisoners being transported with him. Some strongly supported him, since hardly anyone likes rapists. On the other hand, Pedro instantly made some enemies too, because the guy, let's say, is a bit of a troublemaker. Besides, there's an opinion that since Pedro was already quite well known in the media at that time, people really talked about him. Other inmates wanted, so to speak, to attach themselves, to get close to his fame. How? By killing him. I can't exactly track how thoughts are arranged in the minds of criminals, but that's more or less how it happens. If you take down a famous criminal, you become a criminal too, but a more famous one, as if inheriting some of his achievements. In short, murderers always have their own understanding of popularity and fame. Realizing the danger surrounding him, Pedro took out a shiv just in case, and he was right to do so. Eventually, several inmates attacked the man, and he not only managed to fight them off, but also killed them. Let me remind you, he had a shiv, and he wounded some others there as well. Well, it was quite an action scene, to say the least. Shortly after, while in jail, he killed his cellmate. They say he was a real scumbag who sexually harassed the new inmates. No one felt sorry for him, but Pedro waited until he fell asleep and killed him. That's basically how my first year in prison passed. Overall, it wasn't too bad, but Pedro was still struggling with the trauma of losing his loved one and unborn child. But, as they say, life went on. One day, the prison warden summoned Pedro to his office. As you can imagine, this doesn't happen every day. If the prison warden calls you in, you're either in trouble or there's something important to discuss. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. Pedro was told that his mother had been brutally murdered while she was sleeping in her bed. She was stabbed 21 times. You might assume someone outside was seeking revenge on Pedro, since he had many enemies. Can you believe it was actually his father, the man married to his mother, who did it? I guess it goes without saying that Pedro took it really hard. Moreover, lately he and his mom have grown closer. If their relationship was bad when he was a child, now it's actually pretty good. She visited him in prison and they talked there. Just days ago he saw her alive when she visited him. And then suddenly you find out that your father killed your mother. Moreover, it was 21 stab wounds while she was asleep. Pedro really wanted to take revenge for his father's murder. And ironically, that man was convicted and eventually placed in the same prison where Pedro was. Except in a different block, but that wasn't such a big problem anymore. I should mention that what I'm about to describe has many gaps and assumptions, and isn't fully documented. Anyway, if we take the main version, here's how it happened. One evening, Pedro pretended to be sick. Very sick, his stomach hurt, he felt bad, he asked for help. So in short, a guard came to him. Of course, he wanted to help Pedro, but Pedro wasn't actually sick. When the guard entered, Pedro grabbed his keys and gun, threatened him, and said, "Stay here." Then he called the other guards. Well, in the end, he locked all of them in there. In that cell, his own cell. Then he quickly went to another prison block, the one where his father was held. He found him, knocked him to the ground, and stabbed him 22 times, counting each one out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. One more than his father gave his mother. But that wasn't enough. When Pedro saw his father had stopped breathing, he cut out his heart, bit off a piece, chewed and spat it out. He went back to his block, freed the guards, and surrendered to him at once. He didn't resist or try to escape prison. He only wanted revenge for his mother's murder. But my dears, it's worth saying that this story was told by Pedro himself, and he likes to exaggerate a little, not exactly to lie, but to embellish the story, to make it much more interesting than it really is. Anyway, since Pedro's biography in many parts is based on his own accounts, let's be honest, it borders a little between reality and tall tales. You see, the psychiatrist who examined him after the crime, the man told a completely different story. He said his father was killed by relatives, but not by him. And then the Brazilian journalist Mr. Campbell conducted his own investigation, and it turned out that no one killed his father at all. He fell ill and died in prison, and Pedro took credit for his death. This version feels more accurate, though it's not fully proven. As usual, the truth may lie in the middle. Maybe he had someone kill his father, I don't know. But it's impossible to deny the fact that even while he was behind bars, Pedro kept on killing, that's for sure. His reputation definitely preceded him. There were quite a few people outside of prison who believed he was acting very justly, and they started writing him letters. In particular, with requests for him to help them with certain matters, to take someone out. Pedro often agreed to fulfill the requests of his fans, or whatever you want to call them. But of course, only if the criminal who needed to be killed was also in the same prison as him. Then it was at least possible. So he really did continue killing behind bars, and he killed more than one person there. The prison administration didn't know what to do, so they sent him for a psychiatric evaluation. There, it was confirmed. He was a complete psychopath. He isn't tormented by conscience or anything at all. And interestingly, he genuinely believes that he's doing something good. That is, he didn't kill because he liked killing or torturing people. He killed in order to do something good, in his opinion. Even starting from the first murder of that deputy mayor, if you remember. After the examination, Pedro again appeared before the court. At that time, the official number of his victims had reached 71. Let me remind you that when he was admitted to prison, 22 cases were officially confirmed. So, during the time he was behind bars, he took down another 50 people. Well, almost. And these 71 were only the murders in which it was definitely established that Pedro was guilty. He himself kept insisting that he had killed a lot more people, so the man received a second sentence. This time, it lasted 400 years. But before serving those 400 years, he still had to undergo treatment in a psychiatric hospital. During this time, he wasn't allowed any contact with anyone. In 1986, he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital. He was put in a small solitary cell at the Taubat Forensic Treatment Center. At that institution, prisoners rarely encountered each other except during walks or in the dining hall. But even then, they were always under close supervision. Such isolation had its effects on Pedro. He stopped killing. In early 1990, plastic surgeon Josmani Ramos, who had been sentenced to 53 years in prison, was transferred to Taubate for stealing airplanes, smuggling cars, and killing his personal pilot as well as a flight attendant. One day, somehow he and Pedro eventually crossed paths during that walk or somewhere else, and a fight broke out between them. Pedro almost strangled this guy in the end, but the guards, or whatever you call them, the staff of the psychiatric facility, intervened and didn't let it happen. Basically, this was Pedro's last serious offense. In the following years, he really started to live a calm life. He did sports, read books, and that's it. He started talking to journalists and giving interviews. In one of those interviews, he was asked, "If you get out, will you kill again?" He answered, "Yes, I would have to. Simply put, I am a killer. I have always been one." But imagine, despite such statements, and despite the fact that he was sentenced to 400 years, let me remind you, in the end, his punishment was replaced with parole. Wow, why? The Constitution of Brazil basically prohibits life imprisonment. The maximum prison sentence set by law is 30 years. At least it used to be 30 years. And after this term, the prisoner must be released. In 2003, Pedro was supposed to be released. He was really looking forward to this moment. However, at the last minute, the court referred to a provision in the criminal code, according to which crimes committed after the start of imprisonment can be considered new and separate cases. Thanks to this, Pedro's sentence was extended until 2017, but in April 2007, he won an appeal and was released. But soon he was arrested again and put back behind bars. It was for old offenses. I don't know what chaos was on in their system, but he ended up in jail for riots from his first term. He was finally released in December 2017, relatively recently. At that time, he was already 64, and it seemed like he had really left his criminal career behind. He frequently spoke with journalists, gave even more interviews, and repeatedly insisted he had left crime behind for good. No. Once free, the man dove into social media, where he surprisingly found many supporters. He started his own YouTube channel and a TikTok account. In his videos, he warned young people about the dangers of drugs and crime. His TikTok became very popular and had about 300,000 followers. Fans compared him to Dexter. If you watched it, write a comment. If you haven't watched it, write a comment too. Write something. Just write. Most of his followers didn't see him as a villain, but as someone eliminating evil from the world with his own hands. And even though it seemed that Pedro really left the criminal world, that world of crime didn't forget about him. He still had enemies and ended up putting even more of them in jail. And in March 2023, apparently, one of those enemies finally found Pedro. To this day, his killer remains unknown, but one way or another, that's where the story of the criminal, serial killer, vigilante, TikToker, YouTuber ends, my dears. Just like this video. Thank you for watching until the end. That's it, we're out of here.